everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. Today I'm going to be doing the second part of my wrap up of January. I did the first part around January 15th and I kind of anticipated that I would be reading just as much, but I forgot that the semester starts and I teach and I write and it's just taking up so much of my time that my reading list has shrunk a little bit. And I'm also in the middle of reading A Little Life by Hana Yanagihara, so it's like, you know, massive. I'm almost done with that, so maybe my February will be more packed and I'll do 2 videos again, we'll see. So let's get started with the books that I read in the second part of this month. One of the best things that I read this month is a book called The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. This is a nonfiction book about the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. So it's about how at the turn of the century through the 1920s, all of these families moved to the Midwest with this promise of land and wealth from the land, and they tore up all the grass that was holding down the dirt with the expectation that the rains that were keeping the dirt down would continue. But the Midwest had always had a history of dry spells, and when the dry spell hit in the 1930s, without that grass keeping the land in place, dust was just blown everywhere. And of course I had heard about the Dust Bowl, like growing up in the West, you hear about the Dust Bowl, but I don't think I had thought about it in these personal ways. And Timothy Egan follows particular people's stories and how they experienced the Dust Bowl, which made it like quite harrowing and exciting to read about at the same time as it's very devastating. Like, people put their entire lives into these farms and then just had to like pick up and leave and go to California where there were signs that said like no Okies allowed, you can't come here. So I really, really loved The Worst Hard Time. It illuminated a piece of history for me that had always been kind of like dry, and that pun is intended. Like, you think about dust and dust is boring, right? But this is like not boring at all. It's very fascinating. The other nonfiction book that I read this month is The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warner. I have a review video of this, so I won't get too much into it, and I will leave a link to the review in the video description. But just briefly, it's a memoir by Ruth Warner about her childhood in Colonia Liberan, which was a polygamous colony in Chihuahua, Mexico. And in the video I talked about how my family used to go down to Chihuahua every Christmas, and so we would drive by Colonia Liberan and see like glimpses of it, and as we passed I had so many questions for my parents that they just couldn't really answer because they didn't necessarily like want to engage with this creepy, cultish, polygamous colony. Anyway, this book kind of answered a lot of my questions, and there were a lot of weird problems with it that made it more interesting rather than less interesting. So I would love if more people would read The Sound of Gravel and actually talk to me about it. I don't have many people to talk about it yet because it came out January 5th, so go read it. This month I also reread something that was once a favorite, Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. I had been calling this my favorite Kurt Vonnegut novel for years because in high school and maybe the first couple years of college I just read all the Kurt Vonnegut I could get my hands on. So I haven't read everything by him because some things have been published posthumously, like I know he had graduation speeches and letters and stuff published, but I've read every one of Kurt Vonnegut's novels, and this one was my favorite. And rereading it, I could see why my high school self would love it so much. Like, it's very cynical and it's funny and it's full of penis jokes, and you know, who doesn't love a good penis joke, I guess. And I actually really, really liked reading it now, but I could see how if I had read it for the very first time in my 30s, I would have been a little bit skeptical of the voice. It's a little bit dogmatic, like he's telling us stuff about maybe politics and the way that humans interact that hopefully by now you've kind of thought about or figured out already. But at the same time, the structure of it is really complicated. Like, it's very meta. The author gets involved, and the author isn't quite Vonnegut but is, and they're like, he's like interacting with his creations, and that part is really fun and complicated, not simplistic at all. But I'd feel a little bit uncomfortable calling this my favorite Vonnegut novel now. I should probably go back and read some more and see how I feel about those. It's still great though. I really love this book, and it's very nostalgic for me, so that was fun. And the other novel that I read in the second half of the month was Star Wars Volume 1, Heir to the Emperor by Timothy Zahn, I think. Oh, look, my library copy, apparently somebody chewed it off, like some guinea pig or something. Anyway, yeah, it's Timothy Zahn. And this was a long-time curiosity for me. I am a Star Wars fan, but I am not like the biggest Star Wars fan. This is the first Star Wars fiction that I have read, and I had heard that this was the best one, the Heir to the Empire Timothy Zahn trilogy. So I gave it a shot. And I was like into the relationship parts. Like I am interested in how Luke and Han and Leia interact, and that's fun. I was not so interested in like the big space battle scenes. Like the book assumes that you know what all these ships are. Like it assumes that you are a Star Wars fan, you know? And so it's like, oh, and here's the starship and the cruisers and the X-Wings and the T-bones and the, I don't know, all these spaceship names that I don't know about. It was like Top Gun in space, and like nothing is more boring to me than Top Gun. So I was not into those sections, and they were like quite long, those sections, like these intricate battle scenes. I probably won't be reading any more Star Wars fiction, or at least anything in this trilogy. If you know of something else that like, maybe not like slash fiction, but maybe some better written books more about like characters, like character-driven Star Wars books, I could maybe see myself picking that up. But this satisfied a curiosity for me, and now it's satisfied, and I don't need to read any more Star Wars fiction. And for the comic studies portion of my life, I read this Superman book by Les Daniels. It's called Superman: A Complete History, I believe. It doesn't have the title on the cover, you see, it's just like just this picture of Superman, and maybe I'm missing a sleeve or something. The Complete History, The Life and Times of the Man of Steel by Les Daniels. And it's just a history of the character, and it is full of, oh, you got some of my notes here, it's full of pictures and text, which I think is extremely appropriate for this subject matter, especially when he would get into like full, they had examples where they got the rights to full comics issues. So as he was talking about the changes in Superman's character, he could actually give examples, and not just like single images. He could give full issue examples of how Superman's character was changing, which was very helpful, and I don't know that anybody else has access to that. But I think what I suspect is one of the side effects of that access is that he worked closely with DC in producing the book, and so there are some things that feel like they are right along DC party lines. Like he talks about the lawsuit between Siegel and Schuster and DC. He kind of paints Siegel and Schuster as being like kind of greedy and naive, and they were getting enough money anyway, which like, yeah, they were earning a good living in the 40s when Superman was having a heyday, but as soon as they made any trouble, they were out. And like one of them was working as a janitor, I know, like they weren't super wealthy, and so I think that like they had a total right to claim their character and claim that they kind of got swindled by DC. Schuster and Siegel sold the rights to Superman for $130, and you could see how calling them like greedy for trying to get more money is like maybe in line with what DC would have wanted, and I don't know where Les Daniels really is in relationship to DC. But if you are going to read a Superman history and you want it to be succinct and full of images, this is kind of the go-to text for that. And along with the Superman stuff, I'm teaching about comics form right now, so I reread Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, and I finally read his follow-up to that, Reinventing Comics. Oh, there it is. Understanding Comics, I have read 4 times now, maybe. It's a comic book about comics theory. This is like the one that people use when they're talking about comics theory, and it is the book that is assigned in classrooms about comics. And I think that that is great for a start, and really problematic if this is where we end. For example, he has a theory in here about how the simpler a face is drawn in a comic, the more we identify with it. And that's not backed up by any other kind of theory or neurological studies or anything like that. That's just like his personal experience, and while that's very valuable, if that's the end of the discussion on identification in comics, it doesn't really work for me. So part of my project is to challenge a lot of things in this book. I'm very biased about this book. At the same time, as on this rereading, I really appreciated what he did for the form. Like there was nothing in English. There were things in French, but there was nothing in English about really comics theory before Scott McCloud, at least to any sort of engaging level. So I appreciate it. I think that a lot of it is wrong, and I think that a lot of it is right, and it is definitely worth reading if you are interested at all in comics. And then his follow-up, Reinventing Comics, is more about the comics industry, and the second half is all about digital comics and where he thinks digital comics are going, and he wrote it in 2000, so it almost works more as a time capsule than any sort of helpful guide to what digital comics actually do. He had some really cool predictions, some of them came true, some of them didn't. It's really fun to kind of look back and see where digital comics are and where he expected they would be. This one is a little bit less valuable to the classroom for sure than his Understanding Comics, but there's some cool stuff in here too. And the last thing that I have been reading in the second part of January is Fatale by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. This is the same team that does the comic book Criminal, and this is the second trade paperback. I've also read the first and I just promptly gave it back to the library, but I've been really enjoying this series. It's got this very old school drawing style to it that reminds me of like Dark Knight Returns drawings from the 80s. So it's got that like kind of 80s feel. Everything is very straightforward panel-wise, so it's easy to read. It's also full of sex and violence, so it's a little bit like, you know, it's a lot of bit exploitative, and I see how that is kind of a problem because I am enjoying it very much as I read it, especially for the crazy over-the-top violence. But you know, it's been like a really engaging, fun, noir-ish read that I have enjoyed a lot. So if you're looking for something like Lovecraftian and set in that noir 30s, 40s time period, then Fatale might be the thing that you want to pick up. There's like 5 trade paperbacks out, I think, by now. And the last thing that I want to mention, I know this is booktube and this is not a book, but this was one of my favorite things of the second half of January, and one of the reasons that I've been reading a little bit less this month. I watched The Roosevelts in Intimate History, the Ken Burns documentary. Now this is 14 hours long and every hour of it is worthwhile. It starts with Teddy Roosevelt and it moves through to Eleanor Roosevelt's death. So you get a lot about Teddy, a lot about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and a lot about Eleanor Roosevelt. And in the beginning I was really interested in Eleanor. She had this very like kind of tragic childhood where her mother just always told her how ugly she was and how that meant that she wasn't really worth anything, and she had this alcoholic, depressive father, and then she grew up into this, you know, amazing woman. Eleanor Roosevelt is a huge hero of mine. I didn't realize though how moved I would be by Teddy and Franklin Delano Roosevelt stories. At the end of the documentary, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian, gives a quote from Hemingway, who said something, I'm going to paraphrase, but it was something like, life breaks all of us and some people are just stronger in the broken parts. And I got goosebumps just saying that now, thinking about the way that polio broke FDR, or the way that her childhood broke Eleanor, or Teddy had like really bad severe asthma as a child and was kind of like a weakling, and how each of those people grew from that and became these like highly influential, amazing, altruistic sometimes, just incredible people. So I thought that the history was really good here and interesting, but I also thought the personal lessons really worked for me. It almost like worked as self-help at this point in my life. It was like, yeah, things can break you and that's terrible, but then you can grow up and you can be Eleanor Roosevelt and you can like form the UN. It's gonna be amazing for you. So I found this like just really inspiring and wonderful and great if you are interested in American history, or if you're an American history buff. There's something here for everyone. So I would recommend this, and I think it is on Netflix. I got it from the library, so it's like all these discs, but I'm pretty sure that it's available on Netflix. So that is my wrap up for the second half of January. It's been a great month. I've read some really great things, and I am on my way to reading some really great things in February too. I've already read another graphic novel about comics theory, and I'm in the middle of A Little Life, as I said. I'm in the middle of an audiobook by Murakami and the third trade paperback of Fatale, so I am sure I will have a million things to say about February's reading soon. If you've read any of these books, or if you have any recommendations for me based on these books, I would love to hear from you. I am so open to recommendations. Like, if you know of Star Wars fiction I should be reading instead of the Heir to the Empire trilogy, that I would just love you for recommending that. I want to be as big of a Star Wars geek as I can, and I just am not there yet without reading fan fictions. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about my January reading. I'll talk to you soon.